We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day and welcome to the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there's more than just one way to be a man. Now, if this is your first time joining us, this is the show where we take off the masks, where we shed the layers, and we kind of escape the media's magnifying glass so that men can come together, have real conversations, get vulnerable, get real, and talk about the things that are on our minds, on our hearts, the things that are troubling us, the places that we want to go in our lives. We need to know as men who we are in the mirror before we can achieve what it is that we want and create fulfillment in our lives, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. Now, anyway, that's the spiel. But today we have Dr. David Gruder joining us again to wrap up our series on the shadow. Now, if you haven't heard any of the previous episodes on shadow, I recommend you go back to episode 27, where David does a phenomenal job of introducing shadow, how it turns up in our lives, and how we can use this shadowy part of ourselves, the thing that we've judged to be wrong about us, how we can use it as a guide, as an ally. And through all the subsequent guests that we've had this month covering the shadow, I believe those episodes will prepare you for today's topic, which is how shadow turns up in power. Now, wherever you are in the world, there's power at play. Now, here in the United States, I can tell you there is a huge conversation, let's just say debate, battle in some cases around power, right? People asserting their power politically in organizations, in different communities, businesses and companies. And here's the crazy thing about power. Power in its essence really is the ability to influence others. The ability to influence others. And David's going to go into this in much greater detail than I will in this intro. But it really, for me, this interview made me realize just how capable each of us are to have power, whether in the workplace, whether in our intimate relationships. And with this understanding that you're going to gain from this interview, it's my hope that you're going to know that just like Uncle Ben says to Peter Parker in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Because this interview was a chance for me to really look in the mirror and understand how I in my life have used my power, have asserted my power, have used it to get my way, throw my weight around, but also ways in which I've used my power for good. And so for me going forward in my life, I want to commit to being far more of a greater custodian to power and to be more responsible with it now that I have this awareness of how it turns up with shadow. So I hope we can wrap up this shadow series with a very big conversation of shadow in power. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this series on the shadow that we've covered this past month. Anyway, I'm going to shut up. Enjoy. Dr. David Gruder, mate, great to have you back on the show. How you doing, man?
Oh, I'm happy and I'm delighted that you invited me back for a little bit more.
Well, I'll tell you what, the first episode we did together, which as a part of the Shadow series is episode 1, as we're diving into Shadow over this month, has been it's had the most downloads. It's been received the most across the board from all the episodes we've done in the past. And I believe very much a part is that's happened because we have such a huge interest in shadow work now across the world, across the globe. It's becoming a more common thing that's spoken about even outside of what you would call the conscious communities.
Yes, finally, it's starting to get to be known in broader circles.
Yeah, sorry, Jung. It only took 100 years, but we got there. We got there in the end.
Yeah.
So I think there's that, but there's also, I believe, the content and subject matter that we covered David, I just believe you did such a great job of really kind of giving us the foundational understandings of how we develop shadow. And now since then, we've had a couple episodes. The next one was covering, really covering childhood, how we do develop the shadows as a survival mechanism, and how the parents that are listeners can look at the lens of childhood shadow work is not just for the kids, it's for us as parents that are projecting that stuff onto them. How can we go through that process of growth and shadow work while we help our kids work on theirs as well? Since then, we've gone into relationships, right? How can we do our shadow work in relationship to others and identify how we turn up in relationship? And of course, everyone's favorite conversation topic that gives us all the heebie-jeebies, we dove into sex and how shadow turns up in our sexuality. So, mate, we've covered a lot up until this point.
Beautiful.
And today, we're here to talk about power, authority, and how shadow turns up there. So for the listeners, David, could you take a moment just to basically give us an understanding of what shadow looks like when it turns up in power and authority?
Sure. Shadow, when it turns up in power and authority, is basically my attitudes about authority and power that I'm not in conscious, self-responsible relationship with. And as a result of that, though are my attitudes about authority and power negatively influence my relationship not only with my own personal power, but with the personal power of other people. And of course that then impairs my capacity to collaborate effectively.
So are we talking power? Are we talking kind of like a top-down approach, like there is someone above us, an authority figure that is basically giving us orders, or is it more of like there's no real way to kind of put it on a graph?
Right. Well, partly there is. So we're talking about more than just that hierarchical thing, but where power shadow or authority shadow is most likely to erupt is in hierarchical systems where there is a sense that someone is in power over me.
In power over me. Yeah. It's interesting because as I've been a part of men's work and as I've involved myself in shadow work, it's often said that at some point a man can have their power taken away. Well, not just man, any gender, but to have that power taken away. Is there a way that kind of relates to that kind of phrase of having power over someone? Is it this both an act of receiving the kind of dominance-based kind of... I'm trying to grasp this right now because one side of me wants to go into, like fight the power, bra burning, civil rights, right? And then another part of me wants to look at the more structural systems at play here.
Yeah. Well, power is an interactive dynamic. So what that means is that there has to be someone in a role where they have power, whether they're using it well or abusing it, that's something we can get into. But it's always between someone who is seen as having power and someone who sees themselves as not having as much power. So it's interactive. You've got the power utilizer, and you have the person on the receiving end of the power being used.
And in my mind, I can't help but think that hasn't this been the way it's always been throughout known history, is that you have those in power, you have those that aren't, and those that do have the power have a lot more say, have a lot more weight to throw around?
That's a perfect question, Brandon, because that goes to the issue of how we're so used to this. We're so used to power abuse or powerlessness or power, unequal amounts of power, that it's kind of like the fish swimming in water. The fish doesn't know that they're swimming in that water. It's just their environment. And as I was mentioning to you off air, there's a term in the field of linguistics that's really relevant to this. And it's the term in linguistics is called an empty category. And what an empty category is when a phenomenon is occurring that has no name. And the reason that matters is that when something's going on that has no name, we can't develop conscious relationship with it. We can't identify it, and we can't do something about it. And that's what is going on and has been going on throughout history with power and authority shadow.
Okay. That's so interesting that we've got words for almost everything on the planet, but we don't have a word for something that is at play in all of our lives for all of known history, these power dynamics, right? And how power is used.
Yes.
And so I want to look at I want to go to the micro level as it pertains to power, because it's very easy to think on the macro, the bigger scale.
Yeah.
Power, I think dictators, I think, force, I think control. But let's kind of start from the jump. How do we form our understandings of power from an early age?
Right. Well, mostly we develop our relationship with power in response to two types of experiences. One type of experience that all of us have with certain people sooner or later is where we're dealing with someone who's a tyrant, who's using power as a form of manipulation, control, coercion, abuse, etc., etc. We've all been exposed to the people who are power drunk in that way. We've also all been exposed to certain people who have the opposite of that, which is people who are power allergic. They're power phobic, and they actually are suffering from something that in psychology is technically called learned helplessness, where they've learned that they have far less impact than they actually have. And so when we're exposed to this combination of power abuse in some people and power phobia in other people, we develop a screwy relationship with power because we're not seeing healthy expressions of personal power.
Right. And I can't imagine the gap between the learned helplessness and the tyrants of power. I can't imagine that the gap is all that close, because it naturally, I'm sure, would draw a wedge between those two kind of camps, because the tyrant's going to take the power and seize it all, and the one that is power allergic is going to run away from it, or at least deny it.
Yes, and so they kind of stay separate from each other, but the people who are power phobic or power denying carry huge amounts of anger and resentment toward people who are abusing power, and rightly so. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm saying that's inevitable. And what that leads to is either, like you were talking about, running away from power abuse, or sticking one's head in the sand like an ostrich, pretending it's not going on, or going into rebellion against power, either active rebellion and opposition, or trying to do these passive-aggressive sidesteps around power.
And so we've kind of painted power in a bit of a negative light at this point. But really, objectively, if we look at power alone, those that have a lot of it aren't necessarily tyrants. Are there, or are those examples of people that have power and are responsible with it?
I love where you're going with that. So I think it is important that we have a definition of what power is neutrally, regardless of whether it's used in helpful ways or harmful ways. Power is simply the capacity to have impact. That's all that power is, the capacity to have impact.
Right.
And then there's the dark side and the light side of that, the shadow side and the golden side, leaden side and golden side.
Sure. And so the ability to have impact now makes me think, because we've been raised in a culture, at least Western culture that it's the individual that creates change in the world. Like, we are, as rugged individuals carving out our own paths, need to find ways to create some form of ripple. I mean, some might call it an impact. Is that the narrative that you feel like is getting in the way of us being able to kind of equalize and find healthier models of kind of power structures and dynamics, that kind of individual endeavor? Or I'm just curious there. I probably should have asked an open-ended question.
No, that's fine the way you asked it. If we're really going to become literate and effective and loving in how we utilize power, it's important to understand that there are layers of power influence that we're all part of, we're all subjected to. There's our personal power, there's individual power, there's systems power, systems have power, there's language power, there's huge amount of power in language in terms of what gets named and in what ways, how manipulatively or covertly, and power in terms of things that are don't talk rules, things that in any group, in dysfunctional groups, there are rules that we're not allowed to talk about certain things, right? So there are all kinds of layers of power, not just individual power.
Yeah, much like how Dr. Jolly Hamilton and I in the previous episode around sexual shadow, spoke about in certain religions, certain cultures, there's a power over the individual as it pertains to conversations around sex.
Yes.
So
exactly.
We can control and have an impact on the individual if we make conversations around sex taboo.
Yes, and in fact, if we do that, we can have influence over large masses of individuals.
It makes me think about Spider-Man, right? Peter Parker's Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. And that's all starting to kind of become clear for me now, that in the wrong hands, that power can be quite a destructive force, but in the right hands, it can do a lot of good.
It's totally, and it's one of my favorite phrases, and I may have been quoting the wrong person because I thought it was Peter Parker's grandmother who said it.
I will stick up for me and the rest of the Marvel geeks out there. It was Uncle Ben.
Thank you. No, I stand corrected. I thought it was his grandmother. Anyway, the quote is the quote, which is brilliant. With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah. So, mate, what's some examples throughout history that come to mind for you of someone who has had the ability, to create impact over large numbers of people? What have been some examples in your mind of people that have used power in a healthy way and those that have used them in an unhealthy way?
Sure. Well, let's take one of the prime examples from Western history, which would be Jesus. So the person Jesus had a huge amount of positive influence in the Galilee and Jerusalem areas of Israel during his life. And then if we fast forward 320 years, we come to the Council of Nicaea. And this group of theologians and politicians comes together and decides what they need to have people understand that Jesus said and stood for in order to exert power and control over the Greco-Roman Empire. Right? So you take positive influence on the part of Jesus, and then in 300 years that gets turned into political and theological manipulation and power structures over people that have nothing to do with what Jesus stood for. So there you have, in the same package, the light and the dark, the gold and the lead.
Wow. Didn't know that. Wow, you learn something new every day. And isn't that interesting that we've seen that a lot as well in cults, of course, that follow the word of Jesus Christ, but then they twist it and distort it to kind of poison the minds of generally good-hearted individuals, and turns that into a power dynamic that they can use to control. I mean, I think one of the most notorious examples throughout history is Hitler. Mm-hmm. Right? Obviously not in relation to Jesus Christ, but let's create that separation. But look at someone who had a insane amount of impact over a humongous percentage of the world's population to enact one of the greatest atrocities throughout human history. Mm-hmm. Case in point.
Yeah.
Right?
And the tool of Hitler to do that, the main tool, was propaganda. And again, propaganda is language. It's language power. It's the famous saying from Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, was, repeat a lie often enough and it gets seen as the truth. That is power abuse. That's power shadow. And we see that going on all the time today. In fact, the use and misuse of propaganda has reached such a high level in the world that we're in as we're recording this episode, is that people don't even know how to separate fact from fiction, because we've got these alternate facts. Depending on which information bubble you live inside of, you think of certain information as factual, even though it's diametrically opposite to the supposed facts that people in other information bubbles think are true.
And never has that been more clear for me than the previous election. Mm-hmm. I mean, coming from both sides, it was probably the most exhausting election I've ever been a part of, because you have all these opinion shows and these opinion hosts that are, legally they call themselves opinion hosts, but people use it as the news.
Right.
And they can be called out in pure daylight of saying something that is factually incorrect, mm-hmm. something dangerous that is going to enact anger and fear in millions of people's minds, hearts. But then a week later, there's no repercussions, and they're on to the next one. And then it's the next one, and then it's the next one. And the fishing line just gets more tangled and tangled, that all of a sudden someone can become mindlessly addicted to the words that comes out of someone's mouth, even though probably more than 50% of what they say is nonsense.
That's the impact of authority shadow, of power shadow.
Wow. Before we move over to kind of positive examples, I can only imagine it's quite a fine line between positive power and shadow elements of power.
Well, that's because power is simply the capacity for influence. So, of course, there's a thin line, it seems. And it goes to the issue of psychological and spiritual maturity. It goes to the issue of intent and motivation. These are the things that inform our what we do, what we choose to do with the power that we have.
Yeah. It makes me start to wonder if we need to take some of the pressure. I don't know if pressure is the right word, but maybe we need to come back to an understanding that a lot of our leaders of countries, of companies, principals of schools, teachers, remind ourselves that they're human beings and that we all have a capacity to fall one side or the other of that line, and that it's got to be challenging to have a position of power and only do the right thing all the time. Because even the best of us has shadow, and even the best of us can behave in shadow. What if that person, just like you or I, is triggered and behaving in a shadowy way? Oh, and guess what? They're the CEO of Fortune 50 company. Just name them.
Yeah. Well, I work with a lot of CEOs and executives, and they do make mistakes, just like all of us do. I think what separates the power addicted from those who are not addicted to misusing power is self-responsibility. If I make a mistake, if I misuse my power, if I make a decision that has unintended negative impacts, I can always go back afterwards to the people who have been impacted and say the equivalent of, oops, I made a mistake. I either made a mistake in the policy I implemented, or I made a mistake in how I brought this to everyone's attention, or both, and now let's fix it. Now let's repair it. Right? So this is not about people behaving perfectly. It's about people behaving self-responsibly and people being awake rather than asleep about their impacts. Their positive impacts, intended or unintended, because a lot of us have positive impacts we don't even know we have, and then our negative impacts, intended or unintended.
You know, it's almost impossible to avoid, though, the fact that some of our leaders, whether it's politically, business-wise, there's so much in the public eye. There's so much under a microscope that even in the presence of self-responsibility, they're going to cop a lot of shit.
Well, exactly.
In the process.
Because people with power shadow, with a particular type of power shadow or authority shadow, they will put those people in power positions up on a pedestal. They will see them as more perfect than perfect, as more wonderful than wonderful. Or they will react to those people, even if those people in power positions are using power in a wise and loving way. They will react to those people because of their own baggage around power as though they are the enemy. I'll give you a very specific example of what I mean. This goes back to, well, many decades ago. I had just turned 21 years old, and I was brought on by the president of a university to be his administrative assistant. And it was the university that I was going to, and I was in my senior year, my final year at the university. And I had been very involved in campus politics and governance and all of that stuff up until that point. When I was appointed administrative assistant to the president, one of the most influential faculty members on the university faculty, a professor, came to me and he said, "You've changed. You've gone over to the dark side. You've taken this job." And I looked at him and I said, "Stu, I am no different a person today than I was the day before I said yes to taking this position. What are you talking about?" And he basically then shared with me what he didn't know was his relationship with power shadow, which was, there's no way you can take on this role and not be corrupted and not become part of the system and the problem. And what was very interesting was that this particular very influential professor at the university was a political science professor who had no clue about power shadow. So he was projecting onto me that I was now the enemy. And I said to him, "Stu, come back to me in a couple of months and tell me what your impression is then." Which he was a lovely guy and I really liked him, and there was a lot of warmth and regard between us, and he did follow through. And a few months later he came back to me and he said, "I owe you an apology. You haven't changed. You're bringing light. You're bringing love and wisdom to the administration through how you're doing your role. And I said to him, exactly. And are you willing to look at how you projected onto me the notion that I was a different person because I occupied a new role? And he said, yeah, never thought of it. That's power shadow and authority shadow in action. Arrows being thrown at someone in a position of power who was not abusing power. And fortunately, this particular person was awake enough to come back to me later and recognize and own that he had done that projecting and that arrow throwing. But when he was busy throwing the arrows, he had no idea that he was projecting his authority issues onto me.
I think what a remarkable amount of self-awareness you had at 21, David. To be able to call that out.
I know. I still don't know how I knew that or how I knew how to put that into words, but somehow I did. I was bringing through higher wisdom is really what was happening.
Sure. You know, examples that come up for me are probably the two people in the same role, they're friends in the company, and one of them gets a promotion. One of them becomes the boss, the other one becomes the subordinate, and how that impacts their previously healthy relationship. Because perhaps there's some power shadow at play.
Yes.
You know, I said this naively in the beginning, David, that, you know what, I think this could possibly be one of our shorter episodes. And I am sitting here so overwhelmed, like I've got 10 balls up in the air and questions I want to ask as that pertains to power shadow. So for my sake, and perhaps the sake of the listeners, let's break it down to just some of its like rudimentary elements.
Let's do it because this is what I encounter when I talk about power and authority shadow. People think it's small. And then when the Pandora's box is open, they go, oh my God, it pervades everything.
Everything. I mean, let's get into it. So
go ahead. Lay it on me.
Childhood, we form our beliefs of the world. We start to form our idea of what reality is, and power is a part of that kind of soup that we're drinking in the early days, whether that's from our parents or our teachers or what we witness in our leaders on television. Like, we just absorb it all, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. But there is no linear idea of power, right? There's no linear understanding of how it needs to be, how it comes about. Is that the case, or is it?
Tell me, where in any educational system have you ever heard of a course on power education?
Okay, cool. That answers that question. So then we're left as we go through adolescence, adulthood, to try and figure it out on our own of where we stand in that place of power. And based on our previous experiences growing up, we either want to grab at that power, or we want nothing to do with it, or we're going to fight against any forms of power that we find.
You got it. Nailed it.
Okay. We've got Jesus and Hitler. Two examples of kind of good and bad people that have an ability to create impact. We've seen examples like Jesus, who prophesied a good word, and 300 years later it was tweaked and distorted to, again, create control and power.
Yes.
Got it. So I want to ask you, with the understanding that you have around this topic, what questions would you be asking if you could do life over and you're a kid looking at the world? What questions would you be asking about power to kind of form a healthy understanding of it?
Wow, I love that question, Brandon. As a child, if I had the awareness to ask some questions about that, the first question that I would ask is, what is power? The second question I would ask is, how do I use it? What do I use it for? The third question I would ask is, what am I supposed to learn about how to effectively deal with other people who are using their power in positive and negative ways? Those would be the kinds of questions that, if I had the capacity to ask them as a child, those would be the things I'd ask.
So let me ask you that third question, right? How, at what capacities can you use that power in a healthy way?
Right.
I know I just paraphrased your question.
That's okay. Totally fine. So my answer would start off with the reminder that power is simply the capacity to influence. And then I would go from there into the question of motivation. What's my motive? What's my motivation to have influence? Is it to try to make people behave a particular way or believe a certain set of beliefs? Is it to serve people? Is it to bring illumination and light into the world? What's my motivation? And how am I going to use that power? Am I going to try to bring illumination through trying to force people who aren't interested in what I have to offer to pay attention to it? Or am I going to utilize golden power with people who have eyes to see and ears to hear around what I'm wanting to have positive influence around? Am I going to be a dark crusader or am I going to be a light bringer?
Yeah. Basically, which is it, the gold or the shadow that you're going to let kind of be the puppet master in all that, pull the strings?
Yeah.
That is, I've come to those moments so many times, whether it's been in trying to pick up girls out on the town or trying to land a sale, right? The difference between influence and manipulation, there's sometimes not a clear line between the two, but I think you've just kind of illuminated that is what is your intention by saying that thing, by doing that thing, by behaving in that way?
Right. Let me soundbite it this way. Power without love is narcissistic tyranny. Love without power is impotence.
Hey, we get archetypal now. Say that again.
Power without love is narcissistic, self-centered tyranny. And love without power is impotence.
And you can meet in the middle at Jesus.
And Buddha, and name it. There have been so many illumined masters, both widely known and not widely known, that have come down through the ages across cultures, who have embodied that alchemical blend of love, wisdom, and golden use of power.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what we see far more examples of, that get far more publicity, is shadow versions of power, shadow expressions of power, that then simply reinforce us in thinking that anyone that has power, we should be rebelling against, or we should be running from, or we should be placating, or we should be trying to do end runs around.
And what's coming up in me is that if I want to find myself in all of that, I need to access my power. And perhaps my power is telling me to play a supporting role in this work environment or within the Mankind Project. Or my power is telling me to step up and ascend and step into that leadership, grab the steering wheel, right? It's that conversation with self that comes up all the time in these conversations. We're seeing this common thread of clarity of intent. You called it motive.
Yes.
Am I saying this thing to this girl at the bar because I'm trying to get lucky? Or am I saying this thing to this girl to create a connection, an honest, safe, consensual understanding to see where it goes, like being real clear of what that intention is. That is the difference between influence and manipulation right there.
You got it.
Because, and on the same token, there could be a person who thinks in their right mind that I am on the light side of this, but unaware that in fact what they're going to enact, whether it's through the best of intentions, could have a lot of shadow behind it.
Absolutely, because when push comes to shove, we live our lives at the level of our wounds, not our wishes.
Well, guys, gals, and non-binary pals that are listening to this, this is why we have mentors. This is why we have allies. This is why we have enemies. This is why we have people that we can bounce these things off to help us find the path. Whether it's through using that power, whether it's through finding your own individual power, we can't do this alone. We're getting to this again like we did with Mark Green on our episode on relationships. You've got to take on this journey with the support and guidance of others.
The saying that I love is, even though we must do the work for ourselves, we can't do all the work by ourselves.
That was Peter Parker's great uncle.
There we go.
No, I don't know. I just pulled that out.
That one was his grandmother. I don't know.
We call that Marvel mansplaining, but
Good one.
well, I tell you what, David, I was super nervous in the beginning of this conversation once we started because I couldn't put the pieces together in my head of power shadow. I couldn't figure it out, but I feel like now that we've broken it down to its most elementary levels, I can see it now. How do you go through your day-to-day? I mean, you're contracting and getting hired by companies all over the world to speak, to present, to consult. Through what lens are you viewing power structures at play for you, for your place in it?
Right. Through the following lens. Number one, I am brought in because I am viewed as an authority, as an expert. I'm being given a form of power that creates a certain variety of inequality, not on the human level, but the same sort of power as I give when there's a problem at the house that requires an electrician, and I know diddly about electrical stuff, and the electrician comes in, and I give to that electrician a level of expert power because that electrician knows all kinds of stuff about electricity that I don't have a prayer of understanding, right? So the first thing is that I am awake about the form of power that has caused me to be engaged by that company or that CEO or that executive in the first place. So I'm not asleep about that. The second has to do with my recognizing that my role is to bring forth higher wisdom through the energy of love in a business context. So I set my intentions in a noble or high-hearted and high-spirited way. And then I stay awake about two things. I stay awake about whether I am exerting more influence than is appropriate for me to be exerting. I stay awake about whether I'm noticing that people are giving in, being compliant, or whether they're in dialogue relationship with me where when they should be pushing back, they're pushing back, things like that. So I'm constantly in dialogue inside myself around these dynamics of power.
Just straight up self-awareness, right? Knowing your place in the environment, knowing if the person that you're working with is just nodding their head, just saying yes to whatever because they want to, basically seeing them and you in the space to see if it's actually going to achieve what you want to achieve.
Right. And I'm not pretending like I don't have power,
Yes.
nor am I indulging the privilege that I have been given to utilize my influence.
Yeah. Case in point, this role I have, I don't consider myself an authority on men's work, on manhood, or all the stuff that we've spoken about over 30 episodes on this podcast. But I'm someone who's delivering this information, a co-architect in this being out there. It could be so easy for me to kind of flip the switch and turn it to a place of the dark side, you could say. But there's a responsibility here, in this role that not only am I delivering this work, but I'm doing the work, and that I'm presenting it in a way that is in service for the listener.
Yes, and you're in right relationship with, rather than in rebellion against or in denial of, the role that you've chosen to take or fill in the context of this podcast, which is you're a catalyst. You're expressing power in this role through being a catalyst, a midwife.
This is really cool for me. Much like I've been doing a lot of trainings around language. Shout out to the Listening Project at NYU. Understanding listening and language and how that can open or shut doors. This now wants me to, I want to take this understanding, this awareness, and practice it with my business coaching, because I'm a dude that gets hired to coach a company with 79 years of history or different examples there. And I'm going, wow, they're actually listening to what I'm saying and implementing what I'm saying. It really makes me now want to do more kind of checkups from the neck up to be like, all right, Brandon, like, is this information coming from ego? Is this information coming from substance, proof, evidence, right? Is it coming from not just me in the role trying to seek whatever it is that shadow strings are being pulled? Anyway, to say that, wow, this is like some Yoda level stuff.
I'm glad you're getting all of that gold from this, and I really hope our listeners are too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, David, I want to ask you one last thing. You shared an example, like there are those that are averse to power, and so they'll passive aggressively or directly challenge it, fight it, attack it for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I'm sure all of us listening can think of examples of counter movements to certain things.
Oh, yeah, we've seen it or we've done it or both.
Absolutely. How would you encourage someone to approach power shadow if they're witnessing it, whether it's in their families, whether it's in their workplace? How would you instruct someone to approach a conversation around that?
Wow. Okay. So what I'm searching for now is a soundbite length response to something that's a whole topic in and of itself. The first thing that I think is really, really crucial is to discern whether there is teachability or talkability in the person that we might want to speak up with, or if there isn't.
If they're going to receive, basically,
right,
what we're going to share.
Exactly. Because if they're not going to receive, if they're not going to open to seeing things differently, then they're not the person to talk to or intervene with. There's another leverage point in the system that can create positive change. So there's that piece that needs to be sorted out. Now with people who are open, what I like to start with is simply observational wording. So I notice this person is saying blank, or this person has announced such and such a policy, or whatever is data. And I notice that, and then again, data, once again, I notice that the impact was that it was received without pushback, or I noticed that it was pushed back against. So I'm noticing behaviors and I'm observing impacts. And then I'm asking, are those the impacts that are in the highest benefit of us as a couple, or us as a family, or us as a company, or whatever the group is?
Right. So I could say, David, when you introduced this new initiative for the end of Q3 and you didn't hear anything back from the team, this is actually the rumblings of what's been happening behind the scenes since you've introduced this new initiative. Like basically relaying information back with data to say, yeah, you didn't receive any pushback from the team, but it's happening behind the scenes. So that leader's now aware of the impact.
Precisely. Because, and I often introduce the Johari window as a cognitive framework, as a thought set that helps people not be defensive, which is that there are things we know about ourselves that others know about us. There are things we know about ourselves that others don't know about us, not necessarily because we're keeping secrets, but because very few people know everything about us. And there are things that others know about us that we don't know about ourselves. And then there are things about us that we don't know about us and others don't know about us either. Where the gold is in the third box, in that box called, there are things that others know about my unintended impacts, both positive and negative, that I don't know about myself. And I either am teachable, I'm open to learning about those unintended impacts, or I'm not. If I'm truly dedicated to being a person of my word, if I'm truly dedicated to having alignment between my noble intentions and my words and behaviors, my impacts, then I need to know when those are aligned and when those are not. And the people who have the information about that, about those impacts, my impacts, are not me. They're the people I'm impacting.
Wow. I tell you what, if we could have more leaders that had that level of self-awareness and the ability to communicate within their organizations that, hey, guess what? I have blind spots and I can't see them. Perhaps you can. Here's how I like to receive feedback.
Bingo.
Leave it at that.
Bingo. Yep. Here's how I can hear feedback and I'll stay receptive and open. Here's how, if you give me feedback in these other forms, you can depend on me to have a knee-jerk defensive reaction.
That's gold. That's absolute gold. Before we wrap up, David, I think it has to be said, we haven't covered that if that leader isn't receptive to receive the information, what we can do if we're the employee or the manager whose leader is not open to that kind of feedback. Where my mind goes is it comes down to personal responsibility and kind of coming to the I element of, okay, well, what can I do in a healthy way to not undermine this leader, still achieve the goal, but affect the change that is necessary? That's just where my mind goes. It's very much a kind of Jocko Willink extreme ownership kind of approach. I'm curious what yours would be.
So that is one of the elements of mine, is the personal power piece. And for me, the heart of that has to do with my knowing what my boundaries are. And when I'm talking about boundaries now, I'm not talking about ultimatums, lines drawn in the sand, the stuff that passes for boundaries that isn't. For me, what a boundary is any limit I need to honor in order to love or work with someone else without resentment and with integrity. So what I don't do with leaders or people who are in positions of power who are asleep is I don't tell them about them. I don't make you statements. I don't do disguised you statements like, I feel that you are, which is a you statement disguised as an I statement. I simply say, here's what fits or works for me. Here's what doesn't work for me. How can we bridge a gap here so that I can implement what you want implemented in a way that's going to work for me? So it's a very personal form of communication. It's not about, well, things should be done this way, which is philosophical abstraction.
Yeah.
And it's not about disguised you statements. It's about self-disclosure paired with an authentic desire to find a way to collaborate around those boundaries. So that's part one. Part two is systems interventions, which is a whole other topic.
Wow. So yeah, I think for those of you like me whose brains might be pouring out your ears at this point, as we've covered so much juicy stuff here as it pertains to power, I got to give a shout out to Daniel Ellenberg, episode 5 of the Mankind podcast, 3 keys for courageous conversations. One of the keys is clarity of intent, and I believe you guys will enjoy that conversation because it gives a framework for how to address anyone in a conversation that you may think is going to lead to conflict. But we just need that little bit of courage, and you'll be amazed how effectively both parties can achieve some pretty awesome stuff. So
Beautiful.
I'll make sure that's linked in the show notes.
Beautiful.
David,
I love it.
Mate, this has been amazing. Thank you. I appreciate it. I feel like I need to go meditate for a little bit. And that's it speaks to the power of power, because it's not so much an intellectual challenge, it's the mass, the weight of all of it, the awareness for me that this is at play in almost every facet of my life. Directly, indirectly, it's almost like seeing a new color for the first time, going, wow, now that I'm aware of this, it's going to drive me nuts. It's like that car that you see for the first time and then it's everywhere on the road. All of a sudden.
Isn't it remarkable that this form of shadow, power shadow, authority shadow, is so pervasive and yet it's so untalked about?
It's like the king of shadow, the sneaky bastard.
Pretty much.
David, mate, gold as always. How can we find out more about you and your work?
Sure. You can go to my main website, which is drgruder.com. That's drgruder.com. And if you want to know about the online programs that I do, you can go to drgruder.com/academy to get to the Gruder Academy.
Well, mate, I tell you, in the business space, I spend so much time working with various companies, a whole slew of characters involved in all levels of positions, and your name is going to be one of the ones at the end of my tongue as I speak to them as it pertains to their leadership and growth going forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, America's integrity expert and dude who knows a ton about shadow, Dr. David Gruder. Mate, until next time.
Blessings. Thank you so much.
Well, there you have it, the final episode in our series on shadow. Special thanks, of course, goes to Dr. David Gruder, Michael Bonahan, Dr. Jolly Hamilton, Mark Green, and you, the listener, who was bold enough, brave enough, courageous enough to stand in the fire and look at your shadowy bits. You know, it's hard sometimes to acknowledge the parts of ourselves that we aren't proud of, the parts of ourselves that remind us of bad times, bad memories, bad experiences. However, it's through understanding these shadows, and I hope you understand this now that we've gotten to the end of this series, that through understanding these shadows, that they can be a far greater ally than a detriment to our lives. And so I hope that you can now, with this understanding of your shadow, Move forward in life knowing that it is there just to remind you of what it is that you don't want. And from this place, from this understanding, you get to move forward with a far greater understanding of the person you see in the mirror. There is no greater advantage in life than self-awareness. And I hope that this series on shadow and this podcast as a whole gives you a chance to build that self-awareness and build that strength and build the courage to do the things that you want to do, to move to the places that you want to move to, and to experience life in a far greater way. And as my dog wraps us up by having a drink, the selfish little bugger, I just want to thank you for joining us. And we'll see you for the next episode. Lots of love. See ya. This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. Special thanks, of course, goes to my incredible team, Marketing and Communications Director Boyson Hodgson, producer and editor of this episode, Michael Russo, who makes me sound so much more intelligent than I actually am, so of course, special kudos goes there. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.